Across 2,000 years of recorded history, the territory that would become Scotland witnessed the rise and fall of Pictish kingdoms whose carved stones still stand as silent monuments to vanished dynasties. The gradual fusion of Gaelic and British peoples into a medieval realm that would challenge English power for centuries, the emergence of warrior kings and revolutionary thinkers whose names would echo through the corridors of European memory, and the persistent evolution of a national consciousness that survived conquest, union, religious transformation, and economic catastrophe while continuing to shape the political landscape of the British Isles into the present day. The Scottish historical experience encompasses the establishment of one of Europe's oldest continuous monarchies, the development of distinctive legal and ecclesiastical traditions that would resist absorption into English frameworks even after parliamentary union, the production of intellectual and philosophical movements that would influence Enlightenment thought across the Atlantic world, and the cultivation of cultural practices and literary traditions that would come to define Romantic nationalism for audiences far beyond the Highland line. The wars fought across Scottish soil involved some of medieval Europe's most decisive military encounters, while the theological disputes that divided Scottish society produced institutional innovations that would reshape Protestant Christianity across multiple continents. Yet in the centuries before these developments, when Roman legions first probed northward beyond the territories they had subdued in southern Britain, no observer could have predicted that the disparate tribal peoples of Caledonia would eventually coalesce into a kingdom capable of resisting absorption by their powerful southern neighbour. The inhabitants of what is now Scotland in the early centuries of the Common Era represented a complex mosaic of linguistic, cultural and political traditions whose relationships with one another remained as contentious as their collective resistance to external domination. The transformation of these fragmented tribal societies into a unified medieval kingdom required centuries of warfare, intermarriage, religious conversion, and political consolidation, whose outcomes remained uncertain until well into the medieval period. This is the story of Scotland, from the Pictish kingdoms whose mysterious symbols continue to puzzle modern scholars, through the Gaelic incursions that would reshape the linguistic and cultural landscape of the northern half of Britain, the emergence of the medieval kingdom of Alba that would provide the foundation for later Scottish statehood, the apocalyptic struggles of the wars of independence that would define Scottish national consciousness for centuries thereafter, the turbulent reign of the Stewart dynasty, whose members would ultimately unite the crowns of Scotland and England, the religious transformation wrought by John Knox and his fellow reformers, the Jacobite movements that would twice threaten to overturn the Protestant succession, and the gradual emergence of modern Scottish identity within the framework of the British state, culminating in the political and cultural developments that continue to shape Scottish society in the 21st century. The geographical territory that would become Scotland presented distinctive challenges to human settlement and political organisation that would influence the development of Scottish society throughout the historical period. The Highland Massif that dominates the northwestern portion of the Scottish mainland creates a natural division between the fertile lowland areas accessible to continental influences and the mountainous regions where different patterns of social organisation would persist well into the modern era. The extensive coastline, indented by sea locks on the western seaboard and punctuated by major firths on the eastern coast, provided opportunities for maritime communication while simultaneously fragmenting overland travel routes into narrow corridors vulnerable to military control. The island chains of the Hebrides, extending in a great arc from the Butt of Lewis to the Mull of Kintyre, constituted distinct political and cultural zones whose relationships with mainland authorities would remain contested throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The northern archipelagos of Orkney and Shetland, closer to Scandinavia than to the Scottish mainland in both geographical and cultural terms, would follow their own distinctive historical trajectories until their relatively late incorporation into the Scottish realm. The earliest inhabitants of this territory, whose presence can be documented through archaeological evidence, arrived during the retreat of the glaciers that had covered most of Britain during the last ice age. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, who established seasonal camps along the Scottish coastline from approximately the 9th millennium before the Common Era, left traces of their presence in shell middens, stone tool assemblages, and the remains of temporary structures that suggest sophisticated adaptations to the challenging northern environment. The transition to Neolithic agricultural practices, which transformed social organisation across much of Europe, during the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, produced in Scotland a remarkable corpus of monumental architecture whose scale and complexity indicates the presence of societies capable of mobilising substantial labour resources for communal projects. The stone circles, chambered tombs, and ceremonial complexes of Neolithic Orkney, most notably the settlements at Skara Brae and the ritual complex at the Ness of Brodgar, demonstrate that the inhabitants of northern Scotland participated fully in the cultural developments that were reshaping human societies across the Atlantic seaboard of Europe during this formative period. The arrival of metalworking technologies during the Bronze Age, followed by the introduction of iron tools and weapons during the 1st millennium before the Common Era, coincided with the emergence of more hierarchical social structures whose physical manifestations included the construction of fortified settlements and the accumulation of prestigious metalwork in elite burials. The hill forts that crown prominent defensive positions across the Scottish landscape, from the vitrified fortifications of the northeast to the massive earthwork defences of sites like Traprain Law in East Lothian, provide evidence for the consolidation of political authority among warrior elites whose power derived from their capacity to mobilise armed followers and control access to valuable resources. The appearance of distinctive regional artefact styles during the Iron Age suggests the crystallisation of cultural identities that may have corresponded to the tribal groupings encountered by Roman observers when Mediterranean civilization first made direct contact with the peoples of northern Britain. The Roman relationship with the territory that would become Scotland differed fundamentally from the patterns of incorporation and cultural transformation that characterised Roman engagement with southern Britain and other conquered provinces. The campaigns of Gnaeus Julius Agricola, who served as governor of Roman Britain from approximately 77 to 85 of the Common Era, carried Roman military power deep into Caledonian territory, culminating in a major engagement at Mons Graupius in 83 or 84 that Roman sources portrayed as a decisive victory over a coalition of northern tribes. The Roman historian Tacitus, whose father-in-law had commanded the victorious legions, recorded a speech he attributed to the Caledonian leader Calgacus that would provide later Scottish nationalists with eloquent language for their own resistance to southern domination. The famous condemnation of Roman imperialism, that the Romans created a desert and called it peace, resonated through subsequent centuries of Anglo-Scottish conflict as Scottish writers appropriated classical rhetoric for contemporary political purposes. The Roman decision not to incorporate Caledonia into their provincial structure, whether motivated by strategic calculations regarding the cost of occupation or by the practical difficulties of controlling such rugged and sparsely populated territory, established a boundary that would influence political geography for centuries thereafter. The construction of Hadrian's Wall during the 120s of the Common Era, followed by the shorter-lived Antonine Wall across the Fourth Clyde Isthmus during the 140s, created physical demarcations that would contribute to the eventual differentiation of Scottish from English historical experience. The frontier zone between the two walls, where Roman military installations coexisted with indigenous populations whose material culture showed selective adoption of Roman goods and practices, represented a transitional region whose inhabitants maintained relationships with both the Roman provincial system to the south and the unconquered territories to the north. The peoples whom Roman observers encountered in Caledonia, and whom later classical sources would designate as Picts, represented a complex of tribal groupings whose linguistic affiliations and ethnic origins have generated substantial scholarly controversy. The term Picti, meaning painted ones in Latin, first appears in Roman sources from the late 3rd century of the Common Era and may refer to practices of body decoration or tattooing that distinguished the northern peoples from their more Romanized neighbours to the south. The Picts appear to have spoken a language or languages related to the Brittonic Celtic tongues spoken elsewhere in Britain, though the precise classification of Pictish speech remains debated, owing to the extremely limited corpus of Pictish inscriptions and the obscurity of the symbol system that appears on Pictish carved stones. The distribution of Pictish place names and sculptural monuments suggests that Pictish political and cultural influence extended across the territory from the Firth of Forth northward to Shetland, encompassing both the eastern lowlands with their agricultural potential and the more challenging environments of the Highlands and Northern Isles. The political organisation of Pictish society, as reconstructed from fragmentary references in Irish, Northumbrian, and later Scottish sources, appears to have involved a hierarchy of kingdoms whose relationships with one another shifted over time in response to military success, marriage alliances, and the varying fortunes of individual ruling lineages. The later Pictish king lists, preserved in medieval manuscripts that drew on earlier oral and written traditions, suggest a pattern of succession that may have involved matrilineal elements, though the interpretation of this evidence remains contested among specialists. The major Pictish kingdoms whose names appear in the sources, Fortriu in the north, Sursin in the Angus region, Fife with its distinctive identity, and others whose precise locations remain uncertain, competed for supremacy among themselves while facing external pressures from Northumbrian expansion to the south, and increasingly from the 5th century onward, from Gaelic migration to the west. The arrival of Gaelic-speaking peoples from Ireland in the western districts of what is now Scotland initiated a process of cultural and political transformation that would ultimately result in the Gaelicisation of the entire Scottish kingdom. The Kingdom of Dalriata, which straddled the North Channel and encompassed territories in both northeastern Ireland and western Scotland, represented the institutional vehicle for Gaelic expansion into British territory. The chronology and character of Gaelic settlement in Scotland have been subjects of scholarly revision, with earlier models of mass migration giving way to more nuanced interpretations that emphasise the gradual extension of Gaelic political authority over populations that may have included significant indigenous British elements. The documentary sources for early Dalriata, including the genealogical and historical materials preserved in Irish manuscripts, indicate a society organised around competing kindred groups whose rivalries generated chronic internal conflict while simultaneously producing the military capabilities that would eventually enable Gaelic dominance over the Pictish kingdoms to the east. The religious transformation of Scotland during the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries introduced institutional and cultural elements that would profoundly influence subsequent political development. The Christianisation of the Pictish and Gaelic populations proceeded through the efforts of missionary figures whose activities generated hagiographical traditions that would later serve political as well as religious purposes. The career of Columba, the Irish aristocrat and monk who established the monastery of Iona in 563 and whose community would serve as a major centre of Christian learning and missionary activity for centuries thereafter, exemplifies the interweaving of religious and political concerns that characterised early medieval Christianity in the insular world. Columba's connections with the ruling dynasties of both Dalriata and the Pictish kingdoms positioned the Iona community as a player in secular politics, while simultaneously spreading the distinctive forms of monastic organisation and artistic production that would distinguish insular Christianity from continental patterns. The development of the remarkable sculptural tradition that represents one of the most distinctive Pictish contributions to European art history occurred within this context of Christian conversion and cultural transformation. The carved stones that survive across eastern Scotland, from the early symbol stones bearing enigmatic designs to the elaborate cross slabs of the 8th and 9th centuries that combine Christian iconography with secular imagery, provide evidence for a society capable of mobilising skilled craftsmen for the production of monumental art while participating in the broader artistic developments that link the insular world to continental traditions. The interpretation of Pictish symbol systems continues to generate scholarly debate, with proposals ranging from personal or dynastic identification to more complex semiotic functions that may have involved linguistic elements. Whatever their precise meaning, the Pictish stones represent a sustained tradition of monumental sculpture whose quality and distinctiveness indicate the presence of sophisticated cultural institutions capable of training artisans and maintaining stylistic conventions across multiple generations. The political unification of the Pictish and Gaelic populations under a single royal dynasty, traditionally associated with the reign of Tynead mac Ailpeen in the mid-9th century, represented the culmination of processes that had been underway for generations and that would continue to shape Scottish identity long after the formal fusion of the two kingdoms. The circumstances surrounding Tynead's acquisition of Pictish kingship remain obscure, with later medieval sources providing narratives of violent conquest that may reflect subsequent political concerns more than historical reality. The transformation of the Kingdom of the Picts into the Kingdom of Alba, which would eventually become the Kingdom of Scotland, involved the gradual displacement of Pictish identity by Gaelic cultural forms, including the adoption of Gaelic language, the extension of Gaelic ecclesiastical institutions, and the spread of Gaelic naming patterns among the ruling elites. The mechanisms of this cultural transformation, whether involving population replacement, elite imposition, or more gradual processes of assimilation, have been subjects of ongoing scholarly investigation that has modified earlier assumptions about the violent overthrow of Pictish society. The Kingdom of Alba that emerged from the Pictish-Gaelic fusion faced immediate challenges from Viking incursions that had begun to affect the British Isles from the late 8th century onward. The Norse impact on Scotland differed significantly between the northern and western regions, where Scandinavian settlement created new political entities with distinctive cultural characteristics, and the eastern core of the Alba Kingdom, which experienced raiding but not permanent Norse colonisation. The Earldom of Orkney, established under Norwegian overlordship and maintaining connections with Scandinavian power centres for centuries, represented the most substantial Norse political presence in what would later become Scottish territory. The Hebridean Islands and portions of the western mainland came under Norse control during the 9th and 10th centuries, creating a maritime domain whose cultural character blended Gaelic and Scandinavian elements in ways that produced distinctive traditions of art, literature, and political organisation. The consolidation of the Alba Kingdom during the 10th and 11th centuries involved the gradual extension of royal authority over territories that had previously lain outside the Pictish Gaelic core. The incorporation of the Britons of Strathclyde, whose kingdom in the Clyde Valley had maintained a distinctive identity throughout the early medieval period, expanded Alba's southern frontier toward the borders that would eventually define Scotland. The fluctuating boundary with the English kingdoms to the south, contested through military confrontation and diplomatic negotiation over several centuries, would eventually stabilise along approximately its present course during the late medieval period. The relationship between the Scottish kings and their English counterparts involved complex dynamics of alliance, rivalry, and occasional subordination that would generate enduring disputes over the precise nature of Scottish sovereignty in relation to English claims of overlordship. The reign of Macbeth, who held the Scottish throne from 1040 to 1057, and whose historical reality has been largely obscured by the literary mythology generated by Shakespeare's tragedy, illustrates the contested nature of royal succession in 11th century Scotland. Macbeth's acquisition of kingship through the killing of his predecessor Duncan the Feared reflected patterns of competitive succession that characterised Scottish politics during this period, rather than the exceptional villainy attributed to him by later tradition. The stability of Macbeth's 17-year reign, which included a pilgrimage to Rome in 1050 that suggests both the security of his position and his integration into European Christian networks, contrasts sharply with the portrayal of tyrannical usurpation that would later attach to his name. The overthrow of Macbeth by Malcolm III, son of the slain Duncan, initiated dynastic changes that would align Scotland more closely with Anglo-Norman political and cultural developments during the following century. The reign of Malcolm III, known as Canmore or Greathead, established connections with Anglo-Saxon England that would have lasting consequences for Scottish political development. Malcolm's marriage to Margaret, sister of the Anglo-Saxon claimant Edgar Etheling and a refugee from the Norman conquest, introduced continental religious reforms and cultural practices to the Scottish court, while producing a dynasty whose members would shape Scottish politics for generations. Queen Margaret's promotion of Roman ecclesiastical customs in preference to the distinctive practices of the Celtic Church, her foundation of religious houses according to continental models, and her cultivation of continental cultural connections anticipated the broader transformations that would reshape Scottish society during the 12th century. The canonisation of Margaret in 1250 would provide the Scottish royal house with a patron saint, whose cult reinforced the legitimacy of the ruling dynasty, while associating Scottish Christianity with mainstream European devotional patterns. The succession struggles that followed Malcolm III's death in 1093, during a raid into Northumbria, revealed the continuing tensions between different models of royal succession and the competing claims of various branches of the extended royal kindred. The reigns of Malcolm's brother Donald III and half-brother Edmund represented attempts to maintain older Scottish traditions against the Anglo-Norman influences associated with Malcolm's sons by Queen Margaret. The eventual triumph of the Margaretsons, as Malcolm and Margaret's descendants were known, consolidated a pattern of primogeniture succession that would align Scottish kingship with continental European norms, while facilitating the introduction of feudal institutions and Anglo-Norman personnel during the reigns of Edgar, Alexander III and especially David I. The transformation of Scottish government and society during the reign of David III, who held the throne from 1124 to 1153, represented one of the most significant periods of institutional change in Scottish history. David's introduction of Anglo-Norman aristocratic families, whose descendants would include many of the great noble houses of later Scottish history, created a new political and military elite whose territorial lordships reshaped the landscape of power across the Scottish lowlands. The establishment of royal burghs, governed according to legal privileges modelled on English precedents, provided Scotland with urban centres whose commercial functions would sustain the development of a money economy and facilitate royal taxation. The foundation of major monasteries representing the new continental religious orders, Cistercian, Augustinian, Premonstratensian, and others, brought Scotland into closer connection with European ecclesiastical developments, while providing the Crown with literate administrators and diplomatic agents. The administrative innovations of David's reign, including the development of a system of sheriffdoms that would provide the framework for local royal government throughout the medieval period, the introduction of standardised coinage bearing the king's image, and the elaboration of a royal household along Anglo-Norman lines, transformed the Scottish monarchy from a warband leadership into something approaching a bureaucratic state. The consequences of these transformations for the Gaelic-speaking populations of the north and west, whose social organisation did not readily accommodate feudal impositions, generated tensions that would persist throughout the medieval period and beyond. The cultural divide between the increasingly anglicised lowlands and the Gaelic highlands, which would become a defining feature of later Scottish society, had its origins in the differential impact of the 12th century transformations across the various regions of the kingdom. The death of Alexander III in 1286, following a nighttime riding accident that ended a reign notable for its prosperity and stability, initiated a succession crisis that would have catastrophic consequences for Scottish independence. Alexander's children had all predeceased him, leaving his infant granddaughter Margaret of Norway as the only direct heir to the Scottish throne. The negotiations that followed Alexander's death, involving the Scottish nobility, the Norwegian crown, and the English King Edward I, produced an agreement that would have united the Scottish and English crowns through Margaret's marriage to Edward's son, while preserving Scottish institutional independence within a composite monarchy. The death of the young queen during her voyage from Norway to Scotland in 1290, however, eliminated the agreed solution to the succession problem and created an unprecedented situation in which multiple claimants with varying degrees of legitimacy contested the Scottish throne. The invitation to Edward the Rain to arbitrate the succession dispute, which Scottish tradition would later portray as a catastrophic error of judgment by a politically naive nobility, reflected the practical realities of a situation in which no single claimant commanded sufficient support to establish uncontested authority. Edward's insistence on recognition of his overlordship as a precondition for adjudication, and the willingness of the various claimants to accept this condition in pursuit of their individual ambitions, provided the English crown with a legal foundation for intervention in Scottish affairs that would justify decades of warfare. The award of the throne to John Balliol in 1292, following a detailed examination of the competing claims according to the principles of feudal succession, resolved the immediate succession crisis while creating the conditions for the subsequent conflicts that would define the wars of Scottish independence. The reign of John Balliol, which lasted only 4 years before his forced abdication in 1296, demonstrated the impossibility of maintaining Scottish royal authority while simultaneously acknowledging English overlordship in any meaningful sense. Edward's systematic demands for Scottish military service in his wars against France, his insistence on hearing judicial appeals from Scottish courts, and his generally contemptuous treatment of John as a subordinate rather than as a fellow sovereign, provoked a reaction from the Scottish political community that would lead to open defiance. The formation of a council of 12 guardians who effectively assumed governmental authority while nominally acting in John's name, and the negotiation of a defensive alliance with France that would endure in various forms for over 2 centuries, represented attempts to resist English encroachment while preserving the forms of legitimate royal government. Edward's response to this defiance initiated a military campaign that would inaugurate the long struggle for Scottish independence. The English invasion of 1296, which began with the sack of Berwick and the massacre of its inhabitants in March of that year, demonstrated the overwhelming military superiority that Edward could deploy against a Scottish kingdom weakened by internal divisions and lacking the institutional resources to mount effective resistance. The Scottish defeat at Dunbar in April, followed by John Balliol's formal surrender and abdication in July, appeared to have ended Scottish independence definitively. Edward's systematic removal of Scottish symbols of sovereignty, including the Stone of Scone on which Scottish kings had been inaugurated, and the Scottish crown jewels, accompanied his demand for homage from the Scottish nobility and his assumption of direct English rule over Scotland as a conquered province. The apparent completeness of the English victory, however, obscured the continuing capacity for resistance among those elements of Scottish society that had not been incorporated into the Anglo-Norman aristocratic network that dominated the formal structures of political power. The emergence of William Wallace as a leader of popular resistance during 1297 represented a departure from the patterns of aristocratic politics that had characterised the succession crisis and its immediate aftermath. Wallace's social origins remain somewhat obscure, though he appears to have come from the minor gentry rather than from the peasant background that Romantic tradition would later assign him. His initial activities in opposition to English occupation, which included the killing of the English sheriff of Lanark in May 1297, attracted followers whose motivations combined personal grievances, patriotic sentiment, and opportunistic banditry in proportions that cannot now be precisely determined. The growth of Wallace's forces during the summer of 1297, paralleled by a separate rising in the north led by Andrew Murray, created a military challenge that required English attention at a moment when Edward's resources were committed to continental warfare against France. The Scottish victory at Stirling Bridge on September 11th, 1297, demonstrated that English military dominance was not inevitable, and that properly led Scottish forces could defeat English armies under favourable tactical conditions. The destruction of a substantial English army, including the killing of the hated treasurer Hugh Cressingham, whose skin was reportedly used to make sword belts for the victorious Scots, transformed Wallace from a local insurgent leader into a figure of national significance. Wallace's assumption of the title Guardian of Scotland, exercised nominally on behalf of the captive King John, provided a framework of legitimate authority for continued resistance, while sidestepping the complexities of aristocratic rivalries that had paralysed Scottish leadership during the succession crisis. The campaigns that followed Stirling Bridge, including devastating raids into northern England that demonstrated Scottish offensive capability, maintained pressure on the English administration while building Wallace's reputation as a military leader of exceptional capacity. The English counter-offensive of 1298, led by Edward thus in person, with a substantial army that included significant contingents of Welsh longbowmen, demonstrated the continuing disparity in resources between the English crown and its Scottish opponents. The Scottish defeat at Falkirk on July 22, 1298, where Edward's tactical deployment of archery overwhelmed the Scottish schiltron formations that had proved effective at Stirling Bridge, ended Wallace's period of military dominance and forced him to resign his guardianship. The subsequent years of Wallace's career, which involved diplomatic missions to France and possibly to Rome in search of continental support for Scottish independence, illustrated the internationalisation of the Scottish struggle that would characterise the wars of independence throughout their duration. Wallace's eventual capture by the English in 1305, followed by his trial and execution in London on charges of treason that he rejected on the grounds that he had never sworn allegiance to Edward, created a martyr whose memory would sustain Scottish resistance through subsequent generations of conflict. The execution of William Wallace at Smithfield on August 23, 1305, followed the elaborate rituals of punishment that medieval English justice reserved for those convicted of the most serious offences against royal authority. Wallace was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body dismembered and distributed to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth as a warning to those who might contemplate continued resistance. The brutality of his death, however, failed to achieve the pacification that Edward intended, instead providing Scottish resistance with a symbol of martyrdom whose power would only increase with the passage of time. The circumstances of Wallace's capture, which involved betrayal by a Scottish knight named John de Menteith, added elements of treachery and sacrifice to the narrative that would make Wallace's story resonate through centuries of Scottish historical consciousness. Edward's apparent triumph in 1305, which included the promulgation of an ordinance establishing English administrative control over Scotland, and requiring the Scottish nobility to participate in English governmental structures represented the culmination of nearly a decade of effort to incorporate Scotland permanently into the English realm. The emergence of Robert Bruce as a claimant to Scottish leadership during 1306 introduced a figure whose eventual success would transform the political landscape of the British Isles, while establishing patterns of Scottish-English relations that would persist for centuries. Bruce's background combined the Anglo-Norman aristocratic heritage that connected Scottish magnates to their English counterparts, with a claim to the Scottish throne that derived from his grandfather's competition with John Balliol during the succession crisis of the early 1290s. The Bruce family's position during the Wars of Independence had been characterised by a pragmatic flexibility that had seen them support English interests when such support seemed advantageous, while maintaining their claim to the Scottish crown as circumstances permitted. Robert Bruce himself had sworn allegiance to Edward III on multiple occasions, had participated in English campaigns against Scottish resistance, and had served in English governmental structures in Scotland during the period of direct English rule. The transformation of Bruce from English collaborator to Scottish national hero illustrated the fluid nature of political allegiances among the medieval aristocracy and the capacity for dramatic reversals of position when circumstances demanded or permitted such changes. The events that precipitated Bruce's assumption of royal pretensions during early 1306 involved the killing of John Comyn, Lord of Badenoch, in the Greyfriars Church at Dumfries on February 10th of that year. The precise circumstances of this killing remain subject to historical debate, with some accounts suggesting a planned assassination while others portrayed a quarrel that escalated unexpectedly to violence. Comyn had been Bruce's principal rival for leadership of the Scottish resistance movement, representing a family whose extensive land holdings and connections to the Balliol claim created an alternative focus for Scottish loyalty. The elimination of Comyn, whatever the specific circumstances that produced it, removed Bruce's most significant competitor, while simultaneously creating complications that would shape the subsequent course of his career. The killing of a prominent nobleman within the sanctuary of a church constituted both murder and sacrilege, exposing Bruce to ecclesiastical penalties including excommunication, while intensifying the hostility of the Comyn family and its numerous allies. The necessity of moving rapidly to establish his position before his enemies could organise effective opposition drove Bruce to seek coronation as King of Scots at Scone on March 25th, 1306, inaugurating a reign that would eventually triumph, but whose initial years would be characterised by desperate struggle against seemingly overwhelming odds. The English response to Bruce's coronation demonstrated Edward III's continued capacity for military mobilisation, despite his advancing age and declining health. English forces under the command of Aymer de Valence defeated Bruce's army at Methven near Perth on June 19th, 1306, scattering the Scottish forces and forcing Bruce into a period of fugitive existence that would become central to later romantic narratives of Scottish resistance. The subsequent months witnessed the systematic English persecution of Bruce's supporters, including the execution of several of his brothers and the imprisonment of his wife and daughter, while Bruce himself found refuge in the Western Islands and possibly in Ireland during the winter of 1306-1307. The stories associated with this period of Bruce's career, including the famous legend of the spider, whose persistent web building inspired Bruce to continue his efforts despite repeated failures, illustrated the transformation of historical events into national mythology that would characterise Scottish treatment of the Wars of Independence. The death of Edward the Fawn on July 7, 1307, at Burgh by Sands in Cumberland, while preparing yet another campaign against Scotland, removed the most formidable obstacle to Scottish independence and initiated a fundamental shift in the military balance between the two kingdoms. Edward II, who succeeded his father at the age of 23, lacked both the military aptitude and the sustained commitment to Scottish affairs that had characterised Edward III's approach to the conquest and retention of Scotland. The new English king's preoccupation with domestic political conflicts, particularly his reliance on favourites whose influence provoked aristocratic opposition, diverted attention and resources from Scottish affairs while providing Bruce with opportunities to consolidate his position within Scotland. The campaigns of 1307 and 1308 witnessed Bruce's gradual establishment of control over significant portions of Scotland, defeating his Scottish opponents including the Comyn faction, while reducing English strongholds through a combination of siege warfare and guerrilla tactics that avoided the pitched battles, where English military superiority could be brought to bear decisively. The strategy that Bruce adopted during this period of consolidation reflected both the military realities of Scottish weakness relative to English resources and the tactical lessons that the Scottish defeats at Dunbar and Falkirk had provided. Rather than confronting English armies in open battle, where English cavalry and archery could overwhelm Scottish formations, Bruce pursued a campaign of attrition that targeted English-held castles and strong points while avoiding engagement with major English field forces. The systematic reduction of English-held fortifications, often followed by their demolition to prevent their reuse by English garrisons, gradually eroded the infrastructure of English occupation, while demonstrating to the Scottish population that resistance could succeed. The capture of important castles including Aberdeen, Forfar and Dundee during 1308 and 1309 established Bruce's control over substantial portions of eastern Scotland, while the submission of formerly hostile Scottish magnates, sometimes secured through military pressure and sometimes through negotiation, expanded the political base of Bruce's kingship. The Parliament held at St Andrews in March 1309, which formally recognised Bruce as King of Scots and rejected the claims of the Balliol dynasty, provided institutional legitimation for a reign that had begun in circumstances of violence and sacrilege. The international dimensions of Bruce's struggle for recognition extended beyond the immediate military conflict with England to encompass diplomatic relations with the papacy, with France, and with other European powers whose recognition could enhance the legitimacy of Scottish independence. The papacy's position on Scottish independence had been complicated by the circumstances of Bruce's coronation, which followed his commission of murder and sacrilege, and by the ongoing influence that English interests could bring to bear on papal policy. Bruce's excommunication, which had been imposed following the killing of Comyn, remained in effect during the early years of his reign, creating canonical complications that affected the status of those who supported his cause. The diplomatic efforts to secure papal recognition of Bruce's kingship and the lifting of ecclesiastical penalties occupied Scottish envoys throughout the period of military consolidation, eventually achieving success through a combination of persistent advocacy and changing political circumstances at the papal court. The Declaration of Arbroath, produced in April 1320 and addressed to Pope John XIII, articulated a philosophy of Scottish independence and popular sovereignty that would resonate through subsequent centuries of Scottish political thought, asserting that the community of Scotland possessed the right to depose a king who failed to defend its freedom and to choose another in his place. The military climax of Bruce's campaign for Scottish independence arrived on June 23rd and 24th, 1314, when a substantial English army commanded by Edward II in person met Scottish forces under Bruce's command near Stirling Castle. The English expedition of 1314 represented an effort to relieve Stirling Castle, which was under siege by Scottish forces and whose commander had agreed to surrender if not relieved by a specified date. Edward II's mobilisation of English resources for this campaign produced an army whose size, while subject to historical debate, certainly represented one of the largest military forces assembled by an English king during the medieval period. The Scottish army that confronted this English host was substantially smaller in numbers, but fought on ground of Bruce's choosing and under conditions that minimised the tactical advantages of English cavalry and archery. The Battle of Bannockburn, fought over 2 days of intense combat, resulted in a decisive Scottish victory that destroyed English military prestige while confirming Bruce's position as the effective ruler of an independent Scotland. The English defeat involved substantial casualties among the English nobility and military leadership, the capture of significant numbers of prisoners whose ransoms would enrich Scottish coffers, and the flight of Edward VII himself from a battlefield where his army had been comprehensively routed. The significance of Bannockburn extended far beyond its immediate military consequences to establish the symbolic foundation for Scottish independence that would persist through subsequent centuries of conflict and negotiation. The victory demonstrated that Scottish forces could defeat English armies in open battle, reversing the psychological impact of earlier defeats and providing a touchstone of national pride that would sustain Scottish resistance through periods of subsequent difficulty. The practical consequences of the victory included the collapse of English occupation throughout most of Scotland, with English garrisons withdrawing from positions that could no longer be supported following the destruction of the main English field army. The Scottish kingdom that emerged from Bannockburn possessed both the military credibility and the institutional capacity to function as an independent state, though the formal recognition of that independence by England would require another 14 years of intermittent warfare and diplomatic negotiation. The years following Bannockburn witnessed Scottish military expeditions into northern England that combined strategic objectives with economic exploitation of English resources. The campaigns that devastated Northumberland, Cumberland and other northern English counties served multiple purposes, demonstrating Scottish offensive capability while extracting payments from English communities that preferred tribute to the destruction that Scottish raiders could inflict. These northern campaigns also created pressure on the English government to negotiate a settlement that would recognise Scottish independence as the price of peace on the border. The parallel Scottish involvement in Irish affairs during this period, which included an expedition led by Bruce's brother Edward that temporarily established him as High King of Ireland, illustrated the broader ambitions that Scottish independence had enabled while also demonstrating the limits of Scottish power when projected into unfamiliar terrain. Edward Bruce's death at the Battle of Faughart in 1318 ended the Irish venture, while also raising questions of succession that Bruce addressed through the designation of his grandson Robert Stewart as heir to the Scottish throne. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, concluded in May 1328, provided the formal English recognition of Scottish independence that Bruce had sought throughout his reign. The treaty acknowledged Bruce as king of an independent Scotland, renounced English claims to overlordship, and arranged the marriage of Bruce's son David to Joan, the daughter of Edward II and sister of the young Edward III. The diplomatic settlement represented a triumph for Scottish persistence and English exhaustion, coming at a moment when the English government under the Regency established following Edward II's deposition in 1327 sought to resolve external conflicts in order to address domestic political challenges. Bruce's death on June 7, 1329, occurred little more than a year after the formal recognition of his life's work, leaving Scotland independent but facing challenges that would test the institutional foundations that his reign had established. The heart of Robert Bruce, removed from his body after death in accordance with his wishes, was intended for burial in the Holy Land as a fulfillment of crusading vows that Bruce had been unable to complete during his lifetime, though the mission entrusted to Sir James Douglas ended with Douglas's death in Spain in 1330 and the eventual interment of Bruce's heart at Melrose Abbey. The succession of the child King David II, who was only 5 years old at the time of his father's death, initiated a period of minority rule and regency that would expose the vulnerabilities of a Scottish kingdom that had depended heavily on Bruce's personal leadership. The regency arrangements established to govern Scotland during David's minority faced immediate challenges from English-supported efforts to reverse the settlement of 1328 and restore English influence over Scottish affairs. The disinherited Scottish nobles whose lands had been forfeited during the Wars of Independence, many of whom had found refuge in England, provided a ready instrument for English intervention in Scottish politics. Edward Balliol, the son of King John, whose abdication in 1296 had created the circumstances for Bruce's eventual success, emerged as the figurehead for an English-sponsored effort to overturn the Bruce settlement and establish a client kingdom that would acknowledge English overlordship. The invasion of Scotland by the disinherited lords in 1332, culminating in their victory at Duplin Moor in August of that year, initiated a new phase of Scottish-English conflict that would persist intermittently throughout David II's reign. The English intervention in Scottish affairs during the 1330s demonstrated the continuing disparity in resources between the two kingdoms, while also illustrating the resilience of Scottish resistance to English domination. Edward III's personal involvement in the Scottish campaigns, including his victory at Halidon Hill in July 1333, temporarily restored English influence over significant portions of southern Scotland, while forcing David II into exile in France. The Franco-Scottish alliance, which had operated as a diplomatic counterweight to English power since the late 13th century, provided David with refuge and support during his years of exile, while creating strategic complications for English policy that would influence the broader conduct of the 100 Years' War between England and France. The gradual recovery of Scottish territory during the late 1330s and 1340s, achieved through a combination of guerrilla warfare and the exploitation of English preoccupation with French affairs, eventually permitted David's return to Scotland in 1341 and the resumption of active governance under the mature king. David II's reign following his return from exile was characterised by efforts to strengthen royal authority, reform administrative structures, and managed the complex relationships with England and France that Scottish independence required. The Scottish invasion of England in 1346, undertaken in support of French allies during the crisis created by Edward III's victories in France, ended disastrously with the Scottish defeat at Neville's Cross near Durham on October 17th of that year. David II himself was captured during the battle and remained an English prisoner for 11 years, his ransom becoming a significant factor in Scottish politics and Anglo-Scottish relations throughout the period of his captivity. The Regency government that administered Scotland during David's imprisonment maintained Scottish independence while negotiating the terms of the king's eventual release, which was finally achieved in 1357 through agreement to a substantial ransom payment that would burden Scottish finances for decades. The domestic politics of David VI's later reign involved complex negotiations over the succession to the Scottish throne that revealed tensions between the Bruce dynasty and the Stewart family, whose claims derived from Robert Bruce's daughter Marjorie. David's lack of legitimate children created succession uncertainties that he attempted to resolve through various arrangements, including, controversially, proposals that would have designated an English prince as his heir in exchange for cancellation of the ransom debt. The Scottish nobility's resistance to such arrangements, which would have compromised the independence that generations of warfare had established, ultimately preserved the succession rights of the Stuarts, whose eventual accession would create new patterns in Scottish political history. David VI's death on February 22, 1371, ended the Bruce dynasty and brought Robert Stewart to the throne as Robert II, inaugurating a royal house whose descendants would eventually unite the crowns of Scotland and England, while transforming the political structures of the British Isles. The Stuart succession of 1371 represented a fundamental transition in Scottish political history that would shape the kingdom's development for the following 3 centuries while establishing patterns of governance, noble politics, and royal authority that differed substantially from those that had characterised the Bruce period. Robert II, who ascended the throne at the age of 55 following decades of involvement in Scottish politics as Stewart of Scotland and regent during various crises, brought to the monarchy a mature political sensibility shaped by the complex factional conflicts of David II's reign and the accumulated experience of managing noble relationships during periods of royal absence or incapacity. The Stewart dynasty's origins in the hereditary office of High Steward of Scotland, which the family had held since the 12th century, provided a foundation of noble prestige and administrative experience that distinguished them from purely military claimants to royal authority, while also embedding them within the network of magnate families whose cooperation was essential to effective governance. Robert II's extensive family connections, including numerous sons both legitimate and illegitimate who would require provision with lands and offices, created immediate pressures on royal patronage that would characterise Stuart governance throughout the medieval period, while establishing cadet branches of the royal house, whose ambitions and rivalries would influence Scottish politics for generations. The territorial expansion of Stuart influence during Robert II's reign, achieved through strategic marriages, grants of lordships, and the placement of sons in positions of regional authority, distributed royal family members across Scotland in ways that strengthened the dynasty's hold on power, while also creating potential centres of opposition to royal authority when relationships between the Crown and its cadet branches deteriorated. The governance challenges facing the early Stuarts reflected the fundamental tension between royal authority and noble power that characterised medieval Scottish politics, while also revealing the particular difficulties that arose when kings lacked the personal qualities or physical capacity required to dominate the kingdom's magnate families. Robert II's advancing age at the time of his accession, combined with what contemporary sources describe as a gentle and accommodating personality, limited his ability to impose royal authority over the powerful noble families whose cooperation was essential to effective governance, but whose independence could undermine royal interests when not firmly controlled. The delegation of governmental responsibilities to his sons, particularly the future Robert III, whose role in administration increased as his father's capacity diminished, established patterns of royal dependency on family members that would recur throughout Stuart history, while also creating opportunities for conflict between different branches of the royal house. The emergence of Robert Stewart, Earl of Fife, as the dominant figure in Scottish politics during the later years of Robert II's reign and the early years of Robert III's anticipated the recurrent pattern of Stuart governance in which vigorous younger sons or brothers exercised effective authority during periods of royal weakness or minority. The formal recognition of Fyfe's authority through his appointment as Guardian of Scotland in 1388 acknowledged the reality of power distribution within the kingdom while establishing precedents for the exercise of delegated royal authority that would be invoked repeatedly during the troubled Stewart succession. Robert III's reign, which began upon his father's death in 1390, was marked from its outset by the physical disabilities resulting from a horse-related injury that limited his capacity for the active military leadership that medieval kingship typically required, while also undermining his authority in a political culture that valued martial prowess as a fundamental royal quality. The continuation of his brother Fyfe's authority as guardian, modified through various constitutional arrangements but never entirely eliminated, created a diarchy at the heart of Scottish government that complicated policy-making while generating tensions between the king's household and the Guardian's administration. The emergence of David Stewart, Duke of Rothesay, as heir apparent and increasingly active participant in Scottish politics during the 1390s, added a third centre of power within the royal family, whose rivalries would culminate in the catastrophic events of 1402 that eliminated one potential heir while traumatising the royal house in ways that influenced subsequent political decisions. The circumstances surrounding Rothesay's death, while in the custody of his uncle the Duke of Albany, who had succeeded to the guardianship following Fyfe's elevation in the Scottish peerage, remained controversial throughout the medieval period and beyond, with accusations of murder or deliberate neglect shadowing Albany's reputation despite the formal parliamentary exoneration that followed. The death of the heir apparent left Robert III with only his younger son James as potential successor, creating anxieties about the security of the royal line that contributed to the king's decision to send James abroad for safety, a choice whose consequences would profoundly influence Scottish politics for the following generation. The capture of the young Prince James by English agents in 1406, while he was en route to France for education and security, created a diplomatic crisis whose resolution would require nearly 2 decades and whose effects would shape James III's subsequent reign, while also confirming Albany's position as effective ruler of Scotland during the extended absence of both the incapacitated king and the captive heir. Robert III's death shortly after learning of his son's capture, reportedly hastened by grief according to contemporary accounts that portrayed the king as broken by the accumulated misfortunes of his reign, left Scotland without an effective king for the first time since the dark days of the early 14th century when English intervention had threatened the kingdom's very existence. The Albany Regency that governed Scotland from 1406 until James II's eventual release in 1424 represented an extended period of noble governance that maintained Scottish independence and administrative continuity, while also allowing the development of noble interests and autonomies that would create challenges for subsequent royal authority. Murdoch Stewart, who succeeded his father as Duke of Albany and Regent in 1420, lacked the political skills that had enabled his father's successful management of the Scottish nobility, and his regency witnessed increasing disorder and the accumulation of grievances that would influence James III's approach to governance following his eventual return. The negotiations for James III's release from English captivity, which extended across multiple years and involved complex diplomatic calculations regarding the ongoing Anglo-French conflict, and Scotland's role within European power structures, eventually produced an agreement in 1424 that secured the king's freedom in exchange for a substantial ransom and the commitment of Scottish military resources against France, reversing the traditional Franco-Scottish alliance in ways that created immediate diplomatic complications. James I's return to Scotland in April 1424, following 18 years of English captivity that had profoundly influenced his understanding of government and his expectations regarding royal authority, initiated one of the most consequential reigns in Scottish medieval history, marked by ambitious programs of illegal reform, aggressive assertions of royal prerogative, and the systematic confrontation with noble families whose power had expanded during the Albany Regency. The king's English education and exposure to the governmental practices of the Lancastrian monarchy influenced his conception of royal authority in ways that created tensions with Scottish noble traditions, while also providing models for administrative reform that James attempted to implement throughout his reign. The immediate crisis of James I's early rule centred on the Albany Stewarts, whose position as recent regents and whose extensive territorial holdings made them potential rivals to royal authority, while their accumulation of power during the king's absence provided justification for their elimination as a political force. The arrest, trial and execution of Murdoch, Duke of Albany and his sons in 1425 demonstrated James III's willingness to employ drastic measures against threats to royal authority while eliminating a cadet branch of the royal house, whose claims and resources had made them the most significant internal challenge to the restored king. The forfeiture of Albany Stewart lands and the redistribution of their power created opportunities for royal patronage, while also generating anxieties among other noble families about the security of their own positions in the face of an aggressive monarchy. The legislative programme of James III's reign, enacted through a series of parliaments that addressed issues ranging from criminal justice to economic regulation to the organisation of parliamentary representation itself, reflected the king's ambition to transform Scottish governance, while also revealing the limitations that noble resistance and institutional inertia placed upon royal reforming initiatives. The statutes passed during James I's parliaments touched upon virtually every aspect of Scottish life, from the regulation of weights and measures to the organisation of legal procedures to the prohibition of football and other games that interfered with archery practice essential for military preparedness. The attempts to establish regular parliamentary sessions and to create systems of representation for lesser landholders alongside the traditional noble and ecclesiastical estates reflected James III's interest in broadening the basis of royal support while creating institutions that might counterbalance noble power. The enforcement difficulties that characterised many of these reforms, evidenced by the repeated reenactment of similar provisions in successive parliaments, illustrated the gap between legislative ambition and administrative reality that constrained medieval governance, while also demonstrating the practical limits of royal authority in a kingdom where effective power remained substantially localised in noble hands. James I's financial policies, including efforts to recover royal revenues that had been alienated during the Albany Regency, and attempts to establish new sources of income through customs duties and other mechanisms, generated resistance from interest affected by these measures, while providing resources for the enlarged royal household and the architectural projects that expressed James's conception of kingship. The territorial politics of James III's reign involved sustained efforts to extend royal authority into the regions that had developed substantial autonomy during the periods of royal weakness and absence that had characterised Scottish governance since David II's time. The Highlands and Islands, where traditional clan structures and the legacy of the Lords of the Isles created political dynamics quite different from those prevailing in lowland Scotland, presented particular challenges for a monarchy attempting to impose standardised justice and administrative control across the kingdom. The conflicts between James III and the MacDonald Lords of the Isles, whose territories and ambitions made them the most significant power in western Scotland, resulted in alternating periods of confrontation and accommodation that never fully resolved the fundamental tension between royal claims to sovereignty and the practical independence that geography and tradition afforded the Highland territories. The arrest of Highland chiefs at the Inverness Assembly of 1428, intended to demonstrate royal authority and secure hostages for good behaviour, illustrated James I's willingness to employ deception and force in his dealings with the magnate families, while also generating resentments that would complicate subsequent relations between crown and nobility. The resistance of noble families to James II's aggressive assertion of royal prerogative, expressed through formal protests in Parliament and through less visible networks of opposition, reflected the broader tension between royal ambition and noble privilege that characterised late medieval Scottish politics. The assassination of James I at Perth on February 21st, 1437, represented the ultimate consequence of the king's confrontational policies, while demonstrating the vulnerability of medieval monarchs to noble violence when royal actions sufficiently alienated powerful interests. The conspiracy that eliminated James III drew upon grievances accumulated across 13 years of aggressive governance and involved members of the king's own extended family, whose personal losses under his regime had converted them from subjects to assassins. Walter Stewart, Earl of Atholl, whose involvement in the conspiracy reflected both personal ambition and accumulated grievances against his royal nephew, provided the noble leadership for an assassination that its perpetrators apparently hoped would result in a change of dynasty, rather than merely a change of king. The failure of the Atholl conspiracy to achieve its broader political objectives resulting instead in the succession of the young James II, and the gruesome execution of the assassins demonstrated the fundamental stability of the Stewart succession, despite the violence that had claimed its king, while also establishing a narrative of royal martyrdom that would influence subsequent Stewart political mythology. The Regency government that assumed power following James III's assassination faced the familiar challenges of managing noble factions during a royal minority, while also addressing the specific circumstances created by the assassinated king's policies and the involvement of high-ranking nobles in his elimination. James II's long minority, extending from 1437 until 1449, when the young king began to exercise personal authority, witnessed the factional conflicts characteristic of Scottish minorities, while also demonstrating the institutional resilience that enabled Scottish governance to continue functioning during periods of royal incapacity. The struggles between the Crichton and Livingston families for control of the king's person and the Regency government dominated the politics of the 1440s, while creating patterns of alliance and enmity that would influence the factional landscape of James II's subsequent personal rule. The elimination of potential rivals to royal authority during the minority, including the dramatic events at the Black Dinner of 1440 where the young Earl of Douglas and his brother were executed before the child king in Edinburgh Castle, revealed the brutal realities of noble politics while also reducing the power of families whose resources had made them potential challenges to Stuart supremacy. The Douglas family, whose accumulated lands and influence made them the most significant noble power in 15th century Scotland, became the primary target of James II's personal governance once he assumed control of royal affairs, their elimination becoming the defining achievement of a reign that sought to complete the concentration of power that James the Wise had initiated. The confrontation between James II and the Black Douglases culminated in the king's personal murder of the 8th Earl at Stirling Castle in February 1452, an act of calculated violence that demonstrated the intensity of royal hostility toward the family, while also revealing the personal dimension of Stuart kingship in ways that transcended the institutional frameworks of government. The military campaigns that followed James II's murder of the Douglas Earl destroyed the family's political power through the systematic reduction of their castles and the forfeiture of their extensive lands, incorporating territories into royal control that would permanently alter the balance of power between crown and nobility in Scotland. The alliance that the Douglases sought with England, replicating the pattern of the disinherited lords of the previous century, failed to save the family from destruction while confirming their status as traitors whose elimination served the national interest as well as the king's personal ambitions. The redistribution of Douglas lands and offices among families loyal to the crown created a new pattern of noble power that would characterise the second half of the 15th century, while establishing debts of gratitude and obligation that strengthened royal authority over the beneficiaries of Douglas forfeiture. James II's reign following the Douglas Wars was characterised by a more secure royal position that enabled attention to matters of administrative reform and territorial consolidation that the earlier factional conflicts had precluded, although the king's early death during the Siege of Roxburgh in August 1460, when a cannon explosion killed him at the age of 29, prevented the full realisation of the possibilities that the elimination of the Douglases had created. The circumstances of James II's death, resulting from his enthusiasm for artillery, and the accidents that accompanied 15th century experimentation with gunpowder weapons, illustrated both the military innovations that were transforming European warfare and the personal risks that medieval kings assumed when participating directly in military operations. The minority of James III, like those of his father and grandfather before him, created opportunities for noble factions to compete for control of the king and the patronage that proximity to royal authority provided, while demonstrating the cyclical pattern that characterised Stuart governance across the 15th century. The Boyd family's dominance during the early 1460s, achieved through seizure of the young king's person and maintained through strategic marriages and the accumulation of offices, replicated patterns established in earlier minorities while also preparing the conditions for the eventual reaction that would destroy the Boyds once James III assumed personal control. The king's marriage to Margaret of Denmark in 1469, negotiated during the Boyd ascendancy, brought Norway's possessions in Orkney and Shetland under Scottish sovereignty when the promised dowry could not be paid, expanding Scottish territory to its maximum medieval extent, while incorporating the Northern Isles into a kingdom whose geographic reach now extended from the borders to the Arctic. The fall of the Boyd family following James III's assumption of personal authority demonstrated the precarious position of regency families, whose power depended upon control of a minor king rather than upon independent territorial resources, their rapid elimination contrasting with the extended campaigns required to destroy the Douglases, whose landed power had provided a more substantial foundation for resistance. James III's personal reign, extending from the Boyd fall until the king's death in 1488, was characterised by political tensions and noble opposition that reflected both personal qualities of the king and the structural challenges that Stewart monarchy faced in managing relationships with powerful magnate families. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources describe James III as a monarch whose interests and associations differed from the martial and noble culture that Scottish political tradition expected from its kings, his patronage of musicians, architects and low-born favourites, generating resentment among noble families whose expectations of royal behaviour and royal favour were not being met. The emergence of factionalism centred on members of the royal family itself, particularly the conflict between James III and his brothers Alexander, Duke of Albany, and John, Earl of Mar, demonstrated the continuing importance of cadet branches of the Stewart house as potential centres of opposition, while also illustrating the dangerous dynamics that could develop when royal brothers possessed the ambition and resources to challenge the reigning king. The death of the Earl of Mar under circumstances that suggested royal involvement, and the flight of the Duke of Albany to England, where he intrigued with Edward III against his brother, revealed the depths of division within the royal family while creating an exile focus for opposition to James III that would persist until Albany's eventual death. The crisis of 1482, when English-supported invasion coincided with noble rebellion, culminating in the seizure of the king's favourites at Bridge and their summary execution by the noble Confederates, demonstrated the vulnerability of James III to combined external and internal pressure while forcing temporary accommodations that did not resolve the fundamental tensions characterising the reign. The years following the Bridge crisis witnessed an uneasy restoration of royal authority that masked rather than resolved the fundamental divisions between James III and significant portions of the Scottish nobility, whose grievances against the king's governance and personal style remained unaddressed by the temporary accommodations of 1482. The Duke of Albany's brief return to Scotland and his equally rapid fall from favour, followed by his renewed exile and eventual death in France during a tournament accident in 1485, removed one potential focus for opposition, while leaving the underlying conditions that had generated noble discontent essentially unchanged. James III's attempts to reassert royal authority during the mid-1480s, including efforts to recover the revenues and offices that had been alienated during the crisis period, generated renewed tensions with noble families whose interests conflicted with the king's desire to restore and enhance royal power. The king's relationship with his eldest son, James, Duke of Rothesay, deteriorated during this period as the heir apparent became associated with noble factions opposed to his father's governance, creating the conditions for a confrontation that would ultimately prove fatal to the king himself. The rebellion of 1488, which united the heir apparent with a coalition of disaffected nobles including the Humes, Hepburns and other border families, represented both a continuation of the factional conflicts that had characterised the reign and a constitutional innovation in which opposition to the king was legitimised through association with the royal heir. The Battle of Soccieburn on June 11, 1488, fought near the site where Robert Bruce had achieved his great victory at Bannockburn, ended with the defeat and flight of James III, whose death following the battle under circumstances that remain historically obscure but almost certainly involved murder by unknown assailants, concluded a reign whose difficulties had illustrated the challenges facing Stuart monarchy in managing relationships with a powerful nobility while maintaining the resources and respect necessary for effective royal governance. The accession of James IV, achieved through rebellion against his father and tainted by the circumstances of that father's death, began a reign that would prove transformative for Scottish governance and culture, while ultimately ending in the catastrophic defeat at Flodden that would shape Scottish political development for generations to come. The young king's initial position, dependent upon the noble coalition that had placed him on the throne and morally compromised by his involvement in his father's overthrow, required careful management of relationships with the factions that had supported his rebellion, while gradually establishing independent royal authority that would free him from excessive dependence upon any single noble group. James IV's personal qualities, which combined intellectual curiosity, physical energy, linguistic facility, and genuine interest in Renaissance culture, with the martial accomplishments and noble associations that his father had conspicuously lacked, enabled him to establish relationships with the Scottish nobility that avoided the tensions and conflicts that had characterised James III's reign. The king's engagement with the full range of noble culture, including hunting, hawking, tournaments and military exercises, alongside his patronage of learning, architecture and the arts, created a court environment that satisfied both traditional expectations of royal behaviour and the cultural aspirations associated with Renaissance monarchy. The consolidation of royal authority during the 1490s, achieved through the suppression of remaining opposition, the forfeiture of families associated too closely with the previous reign, and the strategic distribution of patronage among noble families whose support the king wished to secure, established foundations for effective governance that would characterise the mature years of the reign. The Western Highlands and Islands, whose semi-independent status under the Lords of the Isles had persisted despite the formal forfeiture of 1493, required sustained royal attention throughout James III's reign, as the king sought to extend effective crown authority into regions where central control had traditionally been nominal or non-existent. The forfeiture of John Lord of the Isles, whose inability to control his kinsmen and vassals had made the lordship more a source of disorder than of ordered governance, eliminated the institutional structure that had provided some coherence to the western seaboard, while creating a power vacuum that various MacDonald claimants and rival clans sought to fill through violence and intrigue. James IV's expeditions to the west, conducted with increasing frequency and military force during the 1490s and early 1500s, represented efforts to impose royal justice and royal authority upon communities whose traditions of violence and feud had developed during generations of weak or distant lordship. The construction of royal castles at strategic locations, the appointment of royal lieutenants with powers to suppress disorder, and the cultivation of relationships with clan chiefs willing to cooperate with crown authority all formed elements of a Highland policy that achieved partial success while also generating resentments that would contribute to future difficulties. The execution of prominent MacDonald leaders, including the hanging of various claimants to the forfeited lordship, demonstrated the king's willingness to employ harsh measures against those whose continued resistance threatened the extension of royal authority, while also creating martyrs whose deaths would be remembered in Gaelic tradition, long after the immediate political circumstances had been forgotten. The transformation of Scottish foreign policy during James III's reign, moving from the traditional French alliance that had shaped Scottish diplomacy for 2 centuries toward a more complex engagement with the emerging great power system of Renaissance Europe, reflected both the king's personal ambitions and the changing international environment within which Scotland operated. The marriage of James IV to Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England in August 1503, represented a diplomatic revolution that contemporaries recognised as potentially transformative for the relationship between the two kingdoms, the Treaty of Perpetual Peace that accompanied the marriage promising an end to the centuries of conflict that had characterised Anglo-Scottish relations since the Wars of Independence. The wedding celebrations at Holyrood, featuring elaborate ceremonies, tournaments, feasting, and cultural displays that demonstrated Scottish participation in Renaissance court culture, provided occasions for the display of royal magnificence that enhanced James IV's reputation, while also illustrating the resources that effective Stewart governance could mobilise for ceremonial purposes. The diplomatic implications of the Tudor marriage, which made James IV brother-in-law to Henry VIII following that king's accession in 1509, while also positioning any future children of the Scottish marriage as potential heirs to the English throne should the Tudor line fail, created connections between the two kingdoms that would ultimately prove more significant than contemporaries could have anticipated. The immediate effects of the marriage on Anglo-Scottish relations were more limited than the rhetoric of perpetual peace suggested, border tensions and diplomatic disputes continuing to trouble the relationship, even as the dynastic connection created new channels for communication and negotiation. The cultural flourishing of James IV's reign, manifesting in architecture, literature, education, and patronage of learning, marked the fullest Scottish participation in the Renaissance cultural movements that were transforming European civilization during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The The construction projects undertaken during the reign, including major works at Stirling Castle, Holyrood Palace, and Falkland, employed craftsmen and designers familiar with continental developments, while creating physical environments that expressed Renaissance ideals of proportion, decoration, and royal magnificence. The king's personal interests, which encompassed languages, medicine, alchemy, and various forms of learning alongside the martial pursuits expected of medieval monarchy, reflected Renaissance concepts of the complete prince, whose cultivation extended across the full range of human knowledge and activity. The establishment of the College of Surgeons in Edinburgh in 1506, and the founding of the first Scottish printing press by Walter Chapman and Andrew Miller in 1507 and 1508, represented institutional developments that would have lasting significance for Scottish intellectual and professional life, while also demonstrating royal support for practical learning and the dissemination of knowledge. The poets of James IV's court, including William Dunbar, Gavin Douglas, and others whose works would constitute the high point of medieval Scottish literature, created a body of vernacular writing that demonstrated Scottish capacity for cultural achievement, while also reflecting the social tensions, religious concerns, and political realities of early 16th century Scottish society. The translation of Virgil's Aeneid into Scots by Gavin Douglas, completed in 1513, represented a literary achievement that demonstrated the capacity of the Scots language for elevated expression, while also participating in the humanist recovery of classical learning that characterised Renaissance culture throughout Europe. The naval ambitions of James the Orme, manifesting most dramatically in the construction of the great warship Michael, launched in 1511 as one of the largest vessels afloat in European waters, reflected the king's desire to establish Scotland as a significant naval power capable of projecting force beyond the immediate coastal waters that earlier Scottish shipping had navigated. The resources devoted to naval construction, including the establishment of shipyards at New Haven and the Pool of Airth, the importation of timber and naval stores from continental sources, and the recruitment of skilled shipwrights and mariners, represented a sustained commitment to naval power that distinguished James IV's reign from those of his predecessors. The Michael itself, requiring the wood of entire forests for its construction, and armed with heavy artillery that represented the latest developments in naval warfare, embodied ambitions for Scottish maritime power that exceeded the kingdom's capacity to sustain, while also providing a symbol of royal magnificence that enhanced the king's reputation throughout Europe. The practical utility of the great ship proved limited, its enormous size making it difficult to man and operate while the costs of its maintenance strained royal finances, yet its construction demonstrated what Scottish resources and royal will could accomplish when directed toward ambitious objectives. The deterioration of Anglo-Scottish relations following Henry V's accession and the formation of the Holy League against France placed James IV in an increasingly difficult position, as his obligations under the renewed French alliance conflicted with the Treaty of Perpetual Peace and the family connections established through his Tudor marriage. The aggressive foreign policy of Henry VIII, directed initially against France and eventually drawing England into continental conflicts that had previously engaged only peripheral Scottish interests, created pressures upon the Franco-Scottish alliance that required James IV to choose between his French obligations and his English peace. The French appeals for Scottish intervention, emphasising both treaty obligations and the traditional rhetoric of the old alliance that had bound the two kingdoms since the 13th century, found receptive audiences among Scottish nobles whose martial culture valued military glory and whose anti-English sentiments had not been extinguished by one generation of uneasy peace. The decision to invade England in support of France, taken despite the counsel of those who urged caution and despite the Queen's reported opposition to war against her brother, committed Scotland to a military campaign that would test whether the military improvements of James IV's reign had created forces capable of confronting English armies in direct battle. The Scottish army that crossed the Tweed in August 1513, representing the largest military force that Scotland had assembled for generations, included contingents from throughout the kingdom whose combined strength demonstrated the effectiveness of James IV's governance in mobilising the military resources of the realm. The artillery train accompanying the army, featuring the large guns whose development James IV had personally encouraged, represented the application of new military technology that had transformed European warfare while also requiring logistical arrangements that complicated the army's movements and contributed to delays that would prove significant. The capture of several English border fortresses, including Norham Castle, whose reduction required sustained bombardment, demonstrated Scottish military capability while also consuming time that allowed the English forces under the Earl of Surrey to complete their preparations and advance to challenge the Scottish invasion. The strategic situation facing James the Thor as September began, with his army established in a strong defensive position on Flodden Edge and English forces approaching from the south, offered opportunities for either withdrawal, with the fruits of a successful campaign, or battle against an enemy whose approach presented both risks and opportunities. The English manoeuvres that brought Surrey's army around the Scottish position, threatening their line of retreat and forcing James the Fourth to reposition his forces on Branxton Hill to meet an attack from an unexpected direction, altered the tactical situation in ways that would prove decisive for the outcome of the engagement. The Battle of Flodden, fought on September 9th, 1513, in the rolling terrain between Branxton Village and the slopes where the Scottish army had taken position, resulted in a catastrophic Scottish defeat whose human costs would shape Scottish political and cultural development for generations to come. The initial Scottish advance conducted downhill against English positions with the long pikes that James Thor had introduced as part of his military reforms, encountered terrain difficulties and English defensive tactics that disrupted the formations upon which pike warfare depended for its effectiveness. The English bills, shorter weapons better suited to the close combat that developed when pike formations lost their cohesion, proved murderously effective against Scottish troops whose unwieldy weapons became impediments rather than advantages once the organised advance broke down into confused melee. The death of James IV himself, fighting on foot among his household men in the desperate final stages of the battle, concluded a reign that had promised much for Scottish development, while also demonstrating the personal risks that medieval concepts of royal military leadership imposed upon kings who took their martial obligations seriously. The scale of Scottish losses at Flodden, including not only the king but also numerous earls, lords, bishops and the flower of the Scottish nobility, created a trauma that contemporaries struggled to comprehend, while also generating practical problems of succession, governance and military recovery that would dominate Scottish politics for years to come. The minority of James VI, beginning with the accession of an infant king whose father's body was never certainly recovered from the Flodden battlefield, inaugurated another cycle of factional competition and foreign intervention that the deaths of so many natural leaders of the nobility had made more chaotic and unpredictable than previous minorities had been. The Queen Mother Margaret Tudor, whose position as mother of the king and sister of Henry VIII gave her potential influence over Scottish affairs, initially assumed the regency provided for in James Thor's will, while also facing challenges from nobles who questioned either her capacity or her willingness to govern Scotland independently of English interests. The arrival of John Duke of Albany, son of the exiled brother of James III and heir presumptive to the Scottish throne, introduced a French-educated prince whose claims to the regency rested upon his proximity to the succession and his connections to the French court that remained Scotland's principal continental ally. The competition between Margaret Tudor and Albany, complicated by Margaret's remarriage to the Earl of Angus, and the factional alignments that this marriage created and destroyed, dominated Scottish politics through the 1510s and 1520s, while the young king remained a pawn whose possession various parties sought to control. The Earl of Angus's eventual seizure of control over the young king, maintained through the later 1520s despite Albany's opposition, and Margaret Tudor's eventual alienation from her second husband, established a period of Douglas dominance that recalled the earlier era when that family's power had challenged royal authority. The young James VI's escape from Douglas custody in 1528, achieved through a dramatic flight from Edinburgh to Stirling, that demonstrated both the king's determination to rule independently and the existence of noble support for liberation from Douglas control, inaugurated a personal reign that would be characterised by aggressive assertions of royal authority against the noble families whose power the king perceived as threatening to crown interests. The forfeiture and exile of the Earl of Angus and his principal supporters, accomplished through judicial proceedings that combined legal forms with political determination, demonstrated James V's willingness to move against even the most powerful noble houses, while also reflecting the personal resentments that years of Douglas custody had generated in the young king. The governance of James V during the 1530s, characterised by determined efforts to enhance royal revenues, extend royal justice, and reduce noble power, created tensions between crown and nobility that reflected both the king's personal style and the structural challenges that Scottish monarchy faced in asserting authority over a society whose local powers remained substantial. The king's financial policies, which included systematic exploitation of ecclesiastical revenues through the appointment of royal infants to wealthy benefices and the extraction of contributions from a church whose vulnerability to royal pressure had increased as Reformation movements challenged traditional religious authority, generated resources that supported royal building projects, household expenses, and the accumulation of treasure that provided security against future emergencies. The establishment of the College of Justice in 1532, creating a central court whose professional judges would provide more consistent administration of royal justice than the occasional sessions of Parliament or Council had previously offered, represented institutional development that would have lasting significance for Scottish legal tradition, while also enhancing royal control over the judicial processes through which disputes were resolved and order maintained. The diplomatic relationships that James I cultivated during his personal reign reflected both the traditional patterns of Scottish foreign policy and the particular circumstances that the Reformation era created for kingdoms seeking to navigate the increasingly complex alignments of European politics. The king's marriage negotiations, which consumed considerable diplomatic effort throughout the early 1530s, demonstrated both the value that continental powers placed upon Scottish alliance and the opportunities that competition for Scottish friendship created for extracting favourable terms from prospective partners. The first marriage to Madeleine of France, daughter of Francis I and symbol of the Franco-Scottish alliance that had structured Scottish foreign relations for 2 centuries, represented the culmination of negotiations that brought James V to France in person, while also providing a princess whose royal blood and substantial dowry enhanced Scottish prestige, even as her fragile health raised concerns about her capacity to fulfill the dynastic purposes that royal marriages were designed to serve. The death of Madeleine within months of her arrival in Scotland, succumbing to the tuberculosis that had long afflicted her in the unfamiliar climate of her new kingdom, created both personal grief for the young king and practical necessity for renewed marriage negotiations that would secure the succession through the production of legitimate heirs. The second marriage to Mary of Guise, widow of the Duke of Longueville and member of the powerful French family whose influence at the French court made them valuable intermediaries between Scotland and France, brought to Scotland a queen whose political abilities and dynastic connections would prove more significant than anyone could have anticipated at the time of her arrival. The Guise family's position within French politics, their militant Catholicism, and their ambitions for influence over European affairs through strategic marriages would all become factors in Scottish history through Mary of Guise's presence and eventual exercise of power, though these developments lay in the future as the new queen established herself at the Scottish court during the later 1530s. The births of 2 sons in rapid succession, James and Robert, seemed to secure the Stewart succession, while providing the male heirs whose existence would stabilise the dynasty and reduce the succession uncertainties that had plagued Scottish politics during the minorities and disputed successions of previous generations. The deaths of both princes within days of each other in 1541, casualties of the childhood diseases that claimed so many infants regardless of their royal status, transformed the succession situation once again, while leaving James the Fire without the direct heirs, whose existence provided both personal comfort and political security. The deterioration of Anglo-Scottish relations during the final years of James III's reign reflected Henry VIII's determination to extend his religious and political influence over Scotland, while also demonstrating the limitations of English power to compel Scottish compliance with demands that threatened both Scottish independence and the religious settlement that James V's government maintained. The English king's summons for James IV to meet him at York in 1541, intended to bring the Scottish king into the English orbit and perhaps to encourage Scottish movement toward religious reform along English lines, created a diplomatic crisis when James IV failed to appear at the appointed meeting, a slight that Henry VIII interpreted as a personal affront requiring military response. The Scottish Council's reluctance to allow their king to place himself within reach of English power, combined with James V's own suspicions about English intentions, had prevented the meeting from taking place, while simultaneously creating the conditions for the military confrontation that followed. The campaign of 1542, which culminated in the disaster at Solway Moss, demonstrated both the military capabilities that Scotland could mobilise and the internal divisions that undermined the effectiveness of Scottish forces when noble cooperation proved uncertain. The Scottish army that crossed into England in November 1542, substantial in numbers and apparently capable of offensive operations, disintegrated in confusion at Solway Moss through a combination of disputed command, poor coordination, and the aggressive action of a much smaller English force whose confidence exceeded what their numbers alone would have justified. The capture of numerous Scottish nobles, including several earls and lords whose imprisonment in England provided Henry VIII with instruments for influencing Scottish policy, compounded a military embarrassment that seemed to confirm English superiority, while creating the conditions for English intervention in Scottish affairs during the minority that was about to begin. The death of James Thorpe in December 1542, occurring at Falkland Palace just days after the birth of his daughter Mary, and weeks after the Solway Moss disaster, brought to an end a reign that had demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of aggressive royal governance in the Scottish context. The king's reported comment upon learning of his daughter's birth, that the Stewart dynasty had begun with a lass and would end with a lass, reflected the despair of a monarch whose male heirs had predeceased him, and whose own death would leave an infant girl to inherit a kingdom whose nobility had just suffered another devastating defeat. The minority of Mary Queen of Scots, beginning with the accession of an infant just 6 days old to a throne, whose adult occupant had just died in circumstances of military disaster and political crisis, inaugurated a period of Scottish history whose complexity and drama would exceed anything that previous generations had experienced. The competition for control of the infant queen and the regency government immediately engaged both domestic factions and foreign powers, whose interest in Scottish affairs had been heightened by the opportunities that minority government presented for influencing Scottish religious and diplomatic alignments. Henry VIII the ambition to secure the marriage of the infant Mary to his son Edward, an arrangement that would unite the Scottish and English crowns and bring Scotland permanently into the English sphere, dominated the early years of the minority, while provoking the resistance that would ultimately frustrate English designs through military force and diplomatic realignment. The Treaties of Greenwich, negotiated in 1543 between the English government and the Scottish faction led by the Earl of Arran, who held the regency, proposed the marriage of Mary to Edward under terms that nominally preserved Scottish independence while creating the dynastic union that would eventually merge the two kingdoms. The Scottish Parliament's initial approval of these treaties, reflecting both the influence of the nobles captured at Solway Moss, who had been released on promises to support English interests, and the genuine appeal that ending Anglo-Scottish conflict held for those who had witnessed the destruction that warfare brought, seemed to promise a peaceful resolution of the questions that had divided the two kingdoms for centuries. The subsequent repudiation of the treaties, accomplished through a parliament that reflected the influence of Cardinal David Beaton and other opponents of English alliance, demonstrated both the depth of resistance to English domination and the effectiveness of those who organised opposition to the Greenwich arrangements. The English response to Scottish repudiation of the treaties, the campaign of destruction that contemporaries called the Rough Wooing, represented Henry VIII's determination to compel Scottish compliance through military force when diplomatic arrangements had failed. The Earl of Hertford's invasions of 1544 and 1545, characterised by systematic destruction of Scottish towns, abbeys and agricultural resources, inflicted damage that exceeded anything that previous English invasions had accomplished, while failing to achieve the political objectives that the destruction was intended to serve. The burning of Edinburgh, the destruction of the abbeys of Melrose, Jedburgh, Kelso and Dryburgh, and the devastation of the Borders region demonstrated English capacity for inflicting harm while simultaneously strengthening Scottish determination to resist demands that were now associated with fire, sword, and the desecration of sacred places. The continuation of these policies under Edward VI's government following Henry VIII's death in 1547, culminating in the English victory at Pinkie and the establishment of English garrisons throughout southern Scotland, seemed to bring Scotland closer to English control than at any point since the Wars of Independence, while also creating the conditions that would lead to French intervention and the removal of the young Queen to safety on the continent. The French alliance that rescued Scotland from English pressure during the late 1540s transformed Scottish politics, while also creating dependencies that would have their own long-term consequences. The arrival of French military forces, whose professional capabilities exceeded what either Scottish or English armies could match, drove the English garrisons from their positions while demonstrating the value of French connection for Scottish independence. The removal of the young Mary to France in 1548, accomplished through French naval power that evaded English attempts at interception, secured the Queen's person from English capture, while also initiating the French upbringing that would shape her character, her expectations, and her ultimate inability to understand the kingdom she would eventually attempt to govern. The betrothal and eventual marriage of Mary to the French Dauphin Francis, heir to the French throne, represented the culmination of Franco-Scottish alliance, while also raising questions about Scottish independence that the marriage arrangements attempted to address through formal guarantees, whose effectiveness would depend upon circumstances that no one could predict. The regency of Mary of Guise, who assumed formal power in 1554 after years of effective influence over Scottish affairs, represented both the extension of French influence over Scottish governance and the determined effort to maintain Catholic religious settlement in a kingdom where Protestant sentiment was growing among significant portions of the population. The Queen Regent's policies, which combined religious conservatism with administrative competence and genuine concern for Scottish interests as she understood them, created a period of relative stability that masked the deepening religious divisions that would soon produce open conflict. The growth of Protestantism in Scotland during the 1550s, nurtured by preachers whose convictions had been formed by exposure to Reformed teaching on the continent, and sustained by nobles whose religious convictions combined with political interests in supporting religious change, created networks of commitment that would prove capable of challenging the established religious order when circumstances provided opportunity. The figure who would give Scottish Protestantism its distinctive character and its most powerful voice emerged from obscurity during this period, though the circumstances of his early life and conversion remain partially obscured by the limitations of contemporary documentation. John Knox, whose origins among the minor gentry of East Lothian provided no indication of the influence he would eventually exercise over Scottish religious and political life, had received education sufficient for ordination as a Catholic priest, while also absorbing the humanist learning that prepared many future reformers for their eventual break with Rome. The conversion experience that transformed Knox from Catholic priest to Protestant advocate occurred during the 1540s through influences that included the preaching of George Wishart, the martyr whose burning in 1546 demonstrated the determination of church authorities to suppress Protestant teaching through exemplary punishment. Knox's association with the group that murdered Cardinal Beaton in retaliation for Wishart's execution, and his presence in St Andrew's Castle during the siege that followed, brought him into the company of those whose commitment to religious change combined with willingness to employ violence in pursuit of their objectives. The capture of St Andrew's Castle by French forces and Knox's subsequent condemnation to the French galleys, where he served for 19 months under conditions designed to break both body and spirit, created the suffering that would inform his later militancy, while also providing the credentials of persecution that authenticated his prophetic claims. The years of exile that followed Knox's release from the galleys, spent in England during the Protestant reign of Edward VI, and subsequently in Geneva, where he encountered the Reformed church order that Calvin had established, shaped the vision of church and society that Knox would attempt to implement upon his return to Scotland. The Genevan model, with its Presbyterian governance, its systematic discipline, its integration of church and civil authority in the enforcement of godly order, and its uncompromising hostility to any remnant of Catholic practice, provided Knox with a template for religious reform that went far beyond the moderate Protestantism that had characterised the English Reformation under Henry VIII. The congregation that Knox served in Geneva, composed of English and Scottish exiles whose commitment to thorough reformation matched his own, constituted a laboratory for the implementation of Reformed practice while also providing the networks of personal connection that would support Knox's later efforts in Scotland. The circumstances that brought Knox back to Scotland in 1559, transforming him from exile preacher to leader of a revolutionary movement, reflected the convergence of religious conviction, political calculation, and international circumstance that made the Scottish Reformation possible. The death of Mary Tudor and the accession of Elizabeth III in England had removed the Catholic Queen, whose persecution had driven English Protestants into exile, while also creating an English government whose interests aligned with Scottish Protestant opposition to French Catholic influence. the French monarchy's increasing difficulties, culminating in the death of Henry II in 1559 and the succession of the young Francis then, whose marriage to Mary Queen of Scots theoretically united the French and Scottish crowns, created uncertainties about French capacity to maintain the military support upon which the Scottish Catholic establishment depended. The Protestant lords who had formed themselves into the Lords of the Congregation, bound by covenant to support religious reformation and resist the religious policies of the regent, provided the political and military framework within which religious change could be accomplished through organised action rather than individual martyrdom. Knox's preaching at Perth in May 1559, delivered to congregations whose emotions had been inflamed by religious controversy and political grievance, ignited the popular violence that transformed religious disputation into physical destruction of the symbols and structures of Catholic worship, the iconoclasm that swept through Perth, destroying the religious houses and stripping the parish churches of images, altars and ornaments that Reformed teaching condemned as idolatrous, established the pattern that would be repeated throughout Scotland as Protestant forces gained control of successive towns and regions. The destruction of the friaries and the dispersal of their communities, accomplished by crowds whose zeal exceeded what the Protestant leadership had anticipated or entirely approved, eliminated institutions that had served Scottish religious life for centuries, while creating the physical evidence of Reformation that subsequent generations would inherit in the ruined abbeys and defaced churches that dotted the Scottish landscape. The civil war that developed during 1559 and 1560 between the forces of the congregation and the regent's government, complicated by French military intervention on behalf of the regent and English intervention on behalf of the Protestants, determined Scotland's religious future through military and diplomatic processes rather than through the theological disputation that had characterised earlier phases of the Reformation controversy. The English army that crossed the border in 1560, fulfilling the Treaty of Berwick that had promised English support for the Protestant cause, besieged the French garrison at Leith, while demonstrating English commitment to preventing French dominance of Scottish affairs. The death of Mary of Guise in June 1560, occurring during the siege and removing the regent whose determination and ability had sustained Catholic resistance, transformed the political situation while negotiations for French withdrawal proceeded toward the Treaty of Edinburgh that would reshape Scottish religious and political alignments. The Reformation Parliament of August 1560, meeting in circumstances of Protestant triumph and Catholic collapse, accomplished the formal changes in Scottish religion that Knox and his colleagues had sought through years of preaching, exile and eventually armed conflict. The Confession of Faith that Parliament adopted, a thoroughly reformed statement of Protestant doctrine that rejected Catholic teaching on the Mass, the papacy, and the role of tradition in religious authority, established the theological foundation for the new Scottish Church. The legislation that prohibited the celebration of Mass and repudiated papal jurisdiction over Scottish religious affairs completed the formal break with Rome while creating the legal framework within which Protestant church order could be established. The Book of Discipline that Knox and his colleagues prepared, outlining their vision for a church organised on Presbyterian principles, with provision for education, poor relief, and moral discipline administered through local congregations and regional assemblies, proposed a comprehensive reformation of Scottish society that went far beyond the changes in formal religious allegiance that the Parliament had accomplished. The return of Mary Queen of Scots in 1561, following the death of her husband Francis II, and her decision to claim her Scottish inheritance rather than remain in France as Dowager Queen, introduced into this reformed settlement a Catholic monarch whose personal religious practice contradicted the official religion of her kingdom. The young queen, whose French upbringing had formed her character and expectations in ways that left her unprepared for Scottish conditions, faced challenges that would have tested the abilities of far more experienced rulers while also possessing personal qualities that inspired loyalty among those who served her. The compromise that permitted Mary to maintain Catholic worship in her private chapel while officially accepting the Protestant settlement that her Parliament had enacted, an arrangement that satisfied neither convinced Catholics nor determined Protestants, established the basis for an uneasy coexistence that depended upon political calculation rather than principled tolerance. The personal reign of Mary Queen of Scots, extending from her return in 1561 to her forced abdication in 1567, constituted one of the most dramatic and consequential periods in Scottish history, generating controversies that would reverberate through subsequent generations, while ultimately destroying the Queen, whose personal story commanded attention that her political judgment could not justify. The initial years of Mary's rule demonstrated possibilities for effective governance that subsequent events would frustrate, as the young Queen worked with Protestant councillors, notably her half-brother the Earl of Moray and Secretary Maitland of Lethington, whose political abilities compensated for her inexperience, while their Protestant convictions ensured continuity with the religious settlement that her arrival had not disturbed. The marriage question that dominated these early years, engaging the diplomatic attention of European courts, whose interest in Scottish affairs had been heightened by Mary's potential claims to the English succession, demonstrated both the international significance that attached to the Scottish Queen and the domestic consequences that her marriage choice would inevitably produce. The selection of Lord Darnley as Mary's husband in 1565, a choice that appeared to strengthen her dynastic position through marriage to a man who possessed his own claim to the English throne through his descent from Margaret Tudor, instead initiated a sequence of disasters that would culminate in Mary's destruction and the transformation of Scottish politics for the remainder of the century. Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley, possessed physical attractiveness and royal lineage in proportions that exceeded his political judgment and personal character, deficiencies that became apparent almost immediately after the marriage that had been celebrated with such hope for the consolidation of Catholic interests and Stuart dynastic ambitions. The rebellion of the Earl of Moray and other Protestant lords who objected to the Darnley marriage, arising that Mary suppressed through military action during the Chaseabout raid of 1565, demonstrated the Queen's capacity for decisive action, while also deepening the divisions between her government and the Protestant establishment that had initially accepted her personal rule. The deterioration of the royal marriage proceeded with remarkable speed, as Darnley's demands for the crown matrimonial, which would have given him equal authority with Mary in Scottish governance, revealed ambitions that the Queen proved unwilling to satisfy, while his exclusion from real power fed resentments that found expression in increasingly erratic behaviour. The murder of David Rizzio in March 1566, accomplished in the Queen's presence by a group of conspirators that included Darnley himself, along with Protestant lords whom Mary had alienated, demonstrated the vulnerability of the Queen's position while traumatising Mary during her pregnancy with the future James VI. The Italian secretary whose influence over Mary had excited jealousy among Scottish nobles, and whose Catholic faith had made him suspect Protestant observers, was dragged from the Queen's supper chamber and stabbed repeatedly in an act of violence that proclaimed the capacity of Scottish nobles to reach even into the monarch's most intimate circle. Mary's survival of this crisis, accomplished through her reconciliation with the conspirators and her subsequent escape from their control, demonstrated political abilities that her later actions would undermine, while also revealing the depth of her estrangement from a husband whose participation in the conspiracy had destroyed whatever remained of conjugal affection. The birth of James in June 1566, providing Scotland with a male heir whose existence secured the Stuart succession while also positioning the infant as a potential inheritor of the English crown, represented Mary's greatest contribution to Scottish dynastic interests, while also creating complications for her personal situation as her marriage to the child's father had become intolerable. The murder of Lord Darnley in February 1567, when the house at Kirkhofield, where he was recovering from illness, was destroyed by an explosion while his body was found in the garden showing signs of strangulation, constituted the pivotal event in Mary's reign and generated controversies that historians continue to debate, while contemporaries drew conclusions that proved fatal to the Queen's political position. The involvement of James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, in the murder plot that eliminated Darnley, whether proven or merely suspected, acquired certainty in the minds of observers when Mary's subsequent behaviour confirmed suspicions that she had been complicit in her husband's death. The sequence of events that followed the Kirkhofield explosion, including the failure to pursue Darnley's murderers with appropriate vigour, the mock trial that acquitted Bothwell of involvement in the killing, and the Queen's apparent abduction by Bothwell followed by her marriage to him in May 1567, destroyed Mary's reputation and provided her enemies with justification for armed opposition that would end her effective rule over Scotland. The confrontation at Carberry Hill in June 1567, where Mary faced a Confederate army of lords who demanded that she abandon Bothwell and submit to their counsel, ended without battle when Bothwell fled, and Mary surrendered to opponents who proved less interested in reconciliation than in securing their own positions through the Queen's removal from power. The imprisonment of Mary at Lochleven Castle and her forced abdication in favour of her infant son James, accomplished under conditions of coercion that Mary would later cite in claiming that her abdication had been invalid, established the Regency government that would rule Scotland for the remainder of James's minority, while Mary remained a prisoner whose potential for disruption haunted the political calculations of those who had deposed her. The coronation of the infant James VI in July 1567, with John Knox preaching a sermon that emphasised the religious significance of a Protestant king succeeding a Catholic queen, completed the formal transfer of authority while establishing the conditions that would shape Scottish governance for the following decade. Mary's escape from Lochleven in May 1568 and her attempt to recover her throne through military action that ended in defeat at the Battle of Langside, followed by her fateful decision to seek refuge in England rather than flee to France, initiated a captivity that would extend for nearly 2 decades, while her presence in England complicated Elizabeth's relations with both Scotland and the Catholic powers of Europe. The Regency period that governed Scotland during James VI's minority, extending from 1567 to 1578 and characterised by factional conflict, civil war between supporters of Mary and the King's party, and the assassination of 2 successive regents, demonstrated the instability that minority rule repeatedly brought to Scottish governance, while also consolidating the Protestant settlement that Mary's personal reign had threatened. The Earl of Marolles, whose abilities had made him the most effective of the Protestant lords, and whose relationship to Mary as her half-brother gave him a claim to lead the King's party, served as regent until his assassination in 1570 by a supporter of Mary's cause, an act that demonstrated the violence that religious and political divisions could generate, while removing the figure best positioned to stabilise Scottish affairs. The successive regencies of the Earl of Lennox, the Earl of Mar and the Earl of Morton, each marked by conflict with Mary's supporters and by competition among noble factions for control of the young king, gradually established the King's party in dominant position, while the Treaty of Perth in 1573 and the fall of Edinburgh Castle to English-supported forces completed the military suppression of the Marian cause within Scotland itself. The personal rule of James VI, beginning effectively in 1578 when the young king began to participate in governance and extending through his succession to the English throne in 1603, demonstrated capacities for political management and intellectual engagement that his troubled childhood had not promised, while also revealing limitations in judgment that would affect his relations with both Scottish and English subjects. James's survival of the factional conflicts that had characterised his minority, including the Ruthven Raid of 1582 when Protestant lords seized his person to remove him from the influence of Catholic councillors, and the Gowrie conspiracy of 1600 whose circumstances remained mysterious even to contemporaries, demonstrated a combination of fortune and political skill that served the king well through circumstances that might have destroyed a less resilient ruler. The king's management of Scottish church affairs, navigating between Presbyterian ministers who demanded that the church remain independent of royal authority, and his own conviction that episcopal structures provided necessary instruments for royal control of religious institutions, established patterns of conflict that would persist through his English reign and would contribute to the civil wars that destroyed his son Charles VI. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots in February 1587, accomplished at Fotheringhay Castle after years of English anxiety about Catholic plots that sought to place Mary on Elizabeth's throne, removed the figure whose claims and whose Catholic faith had made her the focus of international intrigue, while providing James with grievances against Elizabeth that diplomatic considerations prevented him from pressing too vigorously. The death of Mary, whose personal story had combined romantic tragedy with political catastrophe in proportions that ensured her continued fascination for subsequent generations, completed the process by which her son had become the primary representative of Stewart interests, while also eliminating the complications that her survival had created for Anglo-Scottish relations. James's restraint in his response to his mother's execution, accepting English explanations while maintaining his position as Elizabeth's most likely successor, demonstrated the political calculation that would eventually secure his inheritance of the English crown, while also inspiring criticism from those who expected more vigorous defence of maternal honour. The union of the crowns in 1603, accomplished through James's peaceful succession to the English throne following Elizabeth's death in March of that year, represented the culmination of centuries of Anglo-Scottish interaction and dynastic calculation, while initiating a new phase in the relationship between the two kingdoms, whose implications would unfold across the following century. James's journey south to claim his English inheritance, travelling through territories that his ancestors had contested through centuries of warfare and that he now entered as acknowledged sovereign, marked a transformation in British politics whose significance contemporaries recognised, while its consequences remained to be determined through the challenges that a dual monarchy would present. The personal union that joined the crowns of Scotland and England under a single monarch while leaving the kingdoms legally distinct, with separate parliaments, legal systems, and established churches, created arrangements that would shape British politics until the Parliamentary Union of 1707, while also generating tensions that the sharing of a king could not resolve. James's attempts to promote closer union between his Scottish and English kingdoms, including his adoption of the title King of Great Britain, and his efforts to secure parliamentary endorsement for a more comprehensive integration, encountered resistance from English parliamentarians who feared that union would require sharing the benefits of English commercial regulations with Scottish subjects while also diluting English identity in a new British framework. The failure of James's union project demonstrated the persistence of national distinctions that a shared monarchy could not eliminate, while also revealing English attitudes towards Scotland that emphasised English superiority and Scottish subordination in any arrangement that might be contemplated. Scottish participation in English governance remained limited despite James's personal presence in London, though individual Scots who accompanied the king southward achieved positions of influence that excited English jealousy while contributing to the tensions between the king and his English parliaments. The religious policies of James VI and I, seeking to maintain balance between Protestant establishments in both kingdoms while resisting Presbyterian demands for further reformation of church governance, established precedents that his son Charles Thurles would pursue with less flexibility and more catastrophic results. James's success in managing the tensions between Episcopal and Presbyterian tendencies within the Scottish Church, accomplishing the restoration of bishops to Scottish ecclesiastical governance while avoiding the confrontations that more aggressive policies might have provoked, demonstrated abilities in ecclesiastical politics that Charles would fail to replicate. The 5 Articles of Perth that James imposed upon the Scottish Church in 1618, requiring observance of religious festivals and other practices that Presbyterian opinion considered remnants of Catholic superstition, generated resistance that presaged the more violent conflicts that Charles's innovations would produce, while demonstrating the limits of royal authority in matters of religious practice. The reign of Charles III, extending from his succession in 1625 to his execution in 1649, brought to culmination the tensions that had accumulated within Scottish religious and political life, while also demonstrating the consequences of royal policies pursued without adequate attention to the convictions and interests of Scottish subjects. Charles's absence from Scotland during the early years of his reign, remaining in England while governing Scotland through commissioners and councils, deprived him of the personal knowledge of Scottish conditions that might have prevented the miscalculations that would eventually destroy his authority north of the border. The Act of Revocation of 1625, by which Charles sought to recover church lands that had passed into lay hands during the Reformation period, threatened the property interests of Scottish landowners whose support was essential to royal governance, while also revealing Charles's willingness to pursue unpopular policies without adequate consultation with those affected. The introduction of a new prayer book to Scotland in 1637, imposing liturgical practices that Presbyterian opinion associated with Catholic worship, and doing so without consultation with the Scottish church assemblies that claimed authority over such matters, provoked the crisis that would ultimately engulf all 3 of Charles's kingdoms in civil war and revolution. The resistance that erupted in Edinburgh in July 1637, when the first reading of the new prayer book in St Giles Cathedral provoked riots whose intensity surprised authorities who had expected submission to royal religious policies, demonstrated the depth of Scottish commitment to Presbyterian principles and the capacity for collective action that enforcement of unwanted innovations could generate. The National Covenant of 1638, signed by thousands of Scots who pledged to defend Presbyterian religion against what they perceived as Catholic innovations imposed by a distant king, mobilised Scottish resistance in forms that combined religious conviction with constitutional argument about the proper relationship between royal authority and representative institutions. The General Assembly that met in Glasgow in November 1638, defying royal orders to disperse and proceeding to abolish episcopacy and condemn the religious innovations that Charles had attempted to impose, asserted the independence of the Scottish Church from royal control while creating conditions that made military confrontation between king and subjects inevitable. The Bishops' Wars of 1639 and 1640, in which Scottish Covenanting armies confronted royal forces in conflicts that demonstrated Charles's inability to suppress Scottish resistance through military means, established the pattern by which Scottish developments would influence the wider British crisis that culminated in civil war and regicide. The Scottish occupation of northern England following the Second Bishops' War, with Covenanting forces holding Newcastle and demanding payment for their maintenance, forced Charles to summon the English Parliament, whose proceedings would eventually lead to armed conflict between King and Parliament. Scottish intervention in the English Civil War, initially on the parliamentary side through the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643, which promised religious reformation in England along Presbyterian lines in exchange for Scottish military assistance, demonstrated the interconnection of British politics that the Union of the Crowns had created, while also pursuing religious objectives that English parliamentarians would prove unwilling to fulfil. The execution of Charles III in January 1649, accomplished by an English parliament purged of members who opposed such drastic measures, shocked Scottish opinion that had sought to limit royal power rather than destroy monarchy itself, and that regarded the English action as violation of the agreements that had bound the kingdoms together. The proclamation of Charles II as king in Scotland immediately following his father's execution, an act that defied the English Commonwealth and asserted Scottish independence in matters of succession, initiated the conflicts that would end with Cromwellian conquest and the forcible incorporation of Scotland into the English Republican regime. The Scottish military campaigns that sought to restore Charles II through armed force, defeated at Dunbar in 1650, and at Worcester in 1651, where Scottish forces accompanying Charles into England were destroyed by Cromwell's New Model Army, demonstrated both the persistence of Scottish royalism and the military superiority that English resources provided against Scottish resistance. The Cromwellian occupation of Scotland during the 1650s, maintained by English garrisons and enforced by an administration that sought to integrate Scotland into the Commonwealth structure, represented the most complete subordination of Scottish independence to English power since Edward III's Wars of Conquest 3.5 centuries earlier. The parliamentary union imposed during this period, giving Scotland representation in an English-dominated parliament, while suppressing Scottish institutions that had maintained the kingdom's distinct identity, prefigured arrangements that would be adopted voluntarily through the Treaty of Union in 1707, while also demonstrating the coercive aspects that union could assume when imposed by military force rather than negotiated between equals. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 and the subsequent re-establishment of Scottish political and ecclesiastical institutions that the Cromwellian period had suppressed marked a return to the arrangements that had prevailed before the revolutionary upheavals, while also introducing new tensions that would continue through the remainder of the 17th century. The reimposition of episcopacy upon the Scottish Church, accomplished with an intolerance that exceeded anything the early Stewarts had attempted, generated the resistance of Covenanting communities in southwestern Scotland whose persecution during the killing time of the 1680s created martyrs whose memory would sustain Presbyterian identity through subsequent generations. The conflicts between royal authority and Presbyterian conviction that characterised the Restoration period in Scotland, marked by armed risings at Pentland Hills in 1666 and Bothwell Bridge in 1679, by the assassination of Archbishop Sharp in 1679, and by the execution of Covenanters who refused to acknowledge royal supremacy in religious matters, deepened divisions within Scottish society, while creating memories of persecution that would influence Scottish responses to subsequent political crises. The accession of James Sutherland II in 1685 and his removal in the Revolution of 1688 brought to Scotland the consequences of English decisions made without Scottish participation, while also resolving, at least temporarily, the religious conflicts that had troubled Scottish politics since the Reformation. The arrival of William of Orange and his assumption of the Scottish, as well as English crowns, accepted by a Scottish convention that declared James to have forfeited his throne through his violations of fundamental law, established the Protestant succession that would thereafter govern Scottish constitutional arrangements, while also initiating the Jacobite movements that would disturb Scottish and British politics for the following 60 years. The ecclesiastical settlement that accompanied the Revolution, abolishing episcopacy and establishing Presbyterian church governance on the foundations that the Covenanters had sought, resolved in favour of Presbyterian principles the conflicts that had troubled Scottish religious life since the Reformation, while creating the grievances of Episcopalian and Catholic Scots that would fuel Jacobite sentiment through the 18th century. The Treaty of Union of 1707, by which the Scottish Parliament voted to merge with its English counterpart in a single Parliament of Great Britain, while preserving Scottish legal and ecclesiastical institutions, represented the culmination of the process that the Union of the Crowns had initiated, while also marking the end of Scotland's existence as an independent political entity. The negotiations that produced the Union, conducted by commissioners appointed by Queen Anne's government and approved by the Scottish Parliament, despite significant popular opposition, reflected calculations of economic advantage and political necessity that outweighed the sentiment for national independence that many Scots continued to feel. The economic inducements that reconciled many Scottish political leaders to union, including access to English colonial markets and compensation for losses suffered in the Darien disaster of the 1690s, when Scottish colonial ambitions had ended in catastrophic failure, revealed the material considerations that influence political decisions, while also generating accusations of corruption that would persist in Scottish memory. The preservation of Scottish legal and religious institutions within the Union framework, provisions that distinguished the British Union from more centralising alternatives and that maintained elements of Scottish distinctiveness within the new political structure, established the basis for a Scottish identity that could persist despite the loss of political independence. The Jacobite risings of 1715, 1719, and most dramatically 1745, seeking to restore the Stewart dynasty that the Revolution settlement had excluded from succession, demonstrated the persistence of divisions within Scottish society that the Union had not eliminated, while also revealing the capacity for military mobilisation that Highland Scotland retained despite the political and economic transformations that had altered other regions of the country. The final Jacobite rising of 1745, when Charles Edward Stewart landed in Scotland and led an army that reached as far south as Derby before retreating to destruction at Culloden in April 1746, represented both the last serious threat to the Hanoverian succession and the occasion for governmental policies that would transform Highland society while suppressing the institutions and customs that had sustained Jacobite sentiment. The aftermath of Culloden, marked by military occupation, by the suppression of Highland dress and martial traditions, by the abolition of heritable jurisdictions that had maintained the power of clan chiefs, and by policies that sought to integrate the Highlands into the commercial and political structures of the British state, accomplished transformations that earlier centuries of governmental effort had failed to achieve, while also generating the Highland clearances that would depopulate much of the region during the following century. The Scottish Enlightenment that flourished during the latter half of the 18th century, producing intellectual achievements in philosophy, economics, history, and natural science that established Edinburgh and Glasgow as centres of European thought, demonstrated the cultural vitality that Scotland could generate within the British framework, while also contributing to the intellectual foundations of modern social and political thought. The works of David Hume, whose philosophical investigations challenged established certainties while establishing empiricism as the foundation for modern philosophical inquiry, of Adam Smith, whose analysis of economic processes in The Wealth of Nations provided the theoretical framework for modern capitalism, and of the numerous scientists, engineers and inventors whose contributions shaped the Industrial Revolution, represented Scottish participation in the making of the modern world that the political arrangements of the Union had facilitated. The transformation of Scottish society during this period, marked by agricultural improvement, by industrial development concentrated in the central lowlands, by urban growth that reshaped Glasgow and Edinburgh, and by the emigration that dispersed Scottish populations throughout the expanding British Empire, created the conditions within which modern Scottish identity would develop. The Scottish identity that emerged from these centuries of religious reformation, political union, and social transformation combined elements that reflected each phase of the nation's complex history, while also adapting to the circumstances of a world that the processes of modernisation had fundamentally altered. The memory of medieval independence, of the wars that had preserved Scottish sovereignty against English aggression, of Wallace and Bruce and the Declaration of Arbroath, provided symbols of national identity that remained potent despite the political union that had absorbed Scotland into a larger British framework. The Presbyterian heritage that the Reformation had established, with its emphasis on education, moral discipline, and individual responsibility before God, shaped Scottish character in ways that observers from other cultures consistently noted, while Scots themselves internalised as defining elements of their collective identity. The experience of union, simultaneously constraining and enabling limiting political independence, while providing access to opportunities that Scottish resources alone could not have created, generated ambivalences that would persist through subsequent centuries as Scots debated the costs and benefits of their British connection. The long path from the Pictish kingdoms that had first defined a distinct northern British identity, through the medieval consolidation that created the Kingdom of Scotland, the wars of independence that preserved it, the religious reformation that transformed it, and the political union that incorporated it within a larger British state, had produced a nation whose identity remained vital despite the formal ending of its independent political existence. The Scots, who inhabited the industrial cities of the 19th century, who administered the British Empire on which the sun famously never set, who emigrated in their millions to destinations across the globe, carried with them an awareness of distinctive origins that the experiences of Union and Empire could not efface. The Scotland that would emerge from the 20th century's world wars, from the decline of the industries that had defined its economy, and from the constitutional debates that would eventually produce devolution and renewed questions about independence, inherited from the centuries surveyed in this narrative the materials from which continuing identity could be constructed. The transformation of Scotland from a collection of competing peoples speaking different languages and following different customs into a nation possessed of common institutions, shared memories, and distinctive characteristics that marked its inhabitants as a recognisable people, represented an achievement whose significance extended beyond the particular circumstances of Scottish history to illuminate the processes by which human communities define themselves against the background of changing circumstances. The Scotland that exists in the consciousness of those who claim Scottish identity, whether residing within the nation's borders or scattered across the world through centuries of emigration and diaspora, carries the accumulated weight of the experiences that this narrative has traced, from the Pictish stones that still stand in northeastern fields to the documents that preserve the speeches of modern parliamentarians debating the nation's constitutional future. The story that began with Celtic-speaking peoples establishing themselves in territories that Roman legions could not conquer, and that Pictish and Scottish kings would gradually unite under single authority, has continued through transformations that the original inhabitants of these lands could not have imagined. Yet the thread of continuity that connects the Scotland of the present to the Scotland of the most distant recoverable past remains visible to those who seek to understand how nations come into being and how they persist through the changes that time imposes upon all human institutions.